Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of Poli-Side-Eye. Yes, we are still doing this show. It's me and my co-host Jared. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. This is our first time meeting in the new year, so I'm excited to be able to do this.
Yeah, Happy New Year. And the topic today was Jared's choice. And I cannot wait to, hear everyone's comments after we finish this episode. This is a fun topic. It's the political economy of dating. I want you to just explain it away because look, you are leading this conversation today.
So I've always been interested in relationships or how people form relationships. I'm speaking specifically about romantic relationships. And the reason I've always found it so interesting is because it doesn't matter like who I talk to, like gay, straight, men, women, whatever. Like everybody just talks about how much they think dating sucks. And so I just wanted to talk about this because I feel like there are structural things that we could talk about that could maybe provide some insights to our viewers who probably suffer from the same concerns that that a lot of other people do. So that was the impetus behind it.
So, what's the correlation to dating and politics?
Yeah, so the first way I would say is that I think everything is political. I think everything is related to the economy in some way, so capitalism. So that's why we call it political economy, because politics is always about power and struggles over power. And then obviously, like capitalism in some ways sets the terms for how people understand politics. And so if we think about ourselves as existing within a society that is political and capitalist, we have to think about how that affects our dating habits or what we understand to be relationships and love and so on. And so I wanted to talk about it because one thing that I get concerned about, and we can talk about this later, is that I think that sometimes the way that we talk about dating can almost be victim blaming of sorts. Like it's always very individualistic, always like, what am I doing? Instead of like reckoning with like what structural constraints make dating hard for people.
Ain't he smart, y'all? The more you know. Look, I had no idea. Everything involves politics. Okay. So,
We'll die on that hill.
wait, where are we going to start first?
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question. We've talked about this before as friends, but what are some of the main reasons that you what well, let me rephrase that. Why do you think dating sucks so much?
Um, as a black gay man, there's the dating pool. Not that many people want to date. As you know, like, men, particularly gay men, they want to just get right to it. Um,
Sex.
Sex, yes.
Okay, got it.
Personally, for me, I'm just picky. It's just the hassle. I mean, I love to date, but it's just finding someone that, I don't like people in general. So it just really has to be a dynamic person. Like I have all these checkpoints before we even get on a date. So yeah, I mean, it's just hard, it's complicated.
Okay, so yes, it is. So when you say date, what do you mean by that? Because I think one of the main sources of let's say issues that people have with dating is that people differ on what that means to them. So what does dating mean to you?
Courtship, like I want to get to know you. This is our like one-on-one time. Normally, like I wouldn't do a restaurant would be probably like date two, but date one would be like a bar over drinks, like a setting where I can hear you, get to know you. I hate it for it to be like a interview process, but that's kind of like what it is. Like I want to get to know you and see if I want to like continue this and see if the vibes are right. Now if it's really good, I mean, hey, maybe we will sleep on the first date, but I want interaction and the possibility of intimacy.
Okay, so the possibility of intimacy is that so that's the ultimate aim, or at least one of the main aims. Not maybe not the only one, but a important one.
Okay, it's an important one. Top
Okay,
three.
got it. Okay, and so do you feel like most people feel different than you? Do you think most people don't enjoy this process? Or why do you think that you were saying a lot of men just want to get straight to the sex? Like why do you think that they often if it's true, I think it's an open question, but why do you think, in your view, that many men want to skip, let's say, this dating or the courtship, as you called it?
Because they don't want to do all that talking and shit. They just want to go straight to fucking. Like, they want more so the transactional process. But it really does depend on what avenue you looking for men on. If I'm on Hinge as opposed to Grindr or Jack'd, I'm looking for different things. But yeah, I mean, I think most men, and I'm speaking for gay men, y'all, some people just want to skip all the bullshit and just get straight to what we really want. And that's not really true all the time. Like, sometimes I want to find someone that I can actually maintain a consistent routine.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so thank you for answering that, because it gives me some nuggets to like build upon. So I read this book about 2 months ago called The End of Love. So it's a really interesting book. I would recommend it to everybody if you're interested in the discussion we're having today. Because the author's name is Eva Illouz. She's a sociologist, and what she's trying to understand is, in an age in which we seemingly have more choices than we've ever had. Like, it's so easy to like meet people. Obviously, it's easy. You can pick up your phone, you can get on Tinder, you can get on Hinge, you can get on Jack'd if that's your preferred, or Grindr or whatever, Facebook. And yet people have such a hard time still meeting people. And so she goes through all of this research, which shows that despite all of this technology, like, people still feel like they are having a harder time not only meeting people, but like cultivating meaningful relationships with people. So she wants to know, okay, well, what is it? If people on one hand say they want to date, that they want love, that they want relationships, why is it that their behavior isn't aligning with what they claim they want? And so she tries to think about, like, again, the politics and the economy of dating. And so I think one thing that we often overlook in our economy is the way that we're all just perpetually burnt out. That's not to say that, people shouldn't have agency or shouldn't be held responsible for certain forms of their behavior, but I do think it's important to think about, like, why it is that, like, we've all been there before. Like, we'll match with somebody on Tinder, and it seems like trying to actually put something concrete on the table or like on the calendar just won't happen. Like, people will say they're interested, but like, they won't. And so, well, why is that? And so, like, one thing that I think is going on often is that people are lonely. I think that's pretty verifiable. Like, there's quite a bit of survey research or polls that show that, especially since COVID, people have increasingly said that they are lonely. Like, they don't feel like they have community or people that they can depend on. And so I think that part of the reason that people have a hard time, let's say, following up on dating, or why they might resort to just getting straight to the thing, like you kind of said, is because that amount of effort required it requires an amount of like emotional investment. I mean, I hate using that terminology, but it does. And because people already have such a low amount of, let's say, energy because of working fucking 14 hours a day, the amount of energy that you might have left over to do this process is so minuscule. And so I think a lot of people would rather just like skip all of that, and then just get straight to what they think is a more important need, which is like their physical or their sexual need. Now, the next question is, why do people feel as though their sexual needs are more important than their emotional needs? I don't know. Like, why is it that people think it's so much easier, or like, it's easier to just jump straight to the sex than it is to engage in some type of like meaningful connection with people? But getting back to the economy thing, if we think about things being valued based on like their ease of access. So think about it. Why would a purse from Gucci be so much more expensive than a purse from, let's say, JCPenney?
Well, the Gucci bag is probably handmade. Also, the name itself. It's a status symbol for wealth. JCPenney is probably cheaply made.
So
anybody can have it.
I'm so glad you said that. So part of value, as we know from studying economics, is that the more something becomes accessible, or like the easier it is to access a commodity, generally the less valuable it is. Because if you can produce it pretty easily and get it pretty easily, like there's no barrier to entry per se. So like for sex, sure, it's easier to access it, but I think part of the reason people ultimately, not everybody, I can't speak for everybody, but I think part of the reason a lot of people still feel unfulfilled from that is because the value of of the experience is so minuscule and so fleeting. Whereas the value that you derive, think about that time you go on a date and you spend, let's say, hours, and you're just on the edge of your seat, like the butterflies are fluttering. Like it's requiring more of you. Like you're having to be more engaged. You probably have to put your phone down, like really be into this person, listening, carefully responding. That requires a lot more effort, but the payoff is so much greater, because generally after that's done, then you're like, wow, like I feel, even though I feel like I had to put all of this into it, like it felt valuable, like it felt special. And so even though it might cost more to do all of that, you're opening yourself up to potentially being hurt. You're opening yourself up to maybe having a great time, and then come to find out the person doesn't follow up, or like you have this great date, and then like, so all of these things are there. And so what I think ends up happening is that people, even though people implicitly know that it's a high risk, high reward thing, the risk is high that you might go on this date that you really enjoy, but it doesn't, let's say, parlay into a relationship or something more long lasting that you might want. And so I think a lot of people take the more, let's say, risk averse path, which is to skip all that and just go straight to the physical aspect of it. But we know that human beings need more than just like sexual fulfillment. Like we're social creatures. So intimacy isn't just about like the sexual aspect of it. It's also about the forging of emotional connections and emotional bonds. Like, is there a way that we can do both of those things? But it seems like people are having a hard time finding a way to do both of those things. So I was just interested in, thinking about like why it is that people have such a hard time, and like how do people go about like trying to make that process easier?
Okay. I mean, there's just so many factors. Like you can have a good time, but what if the other person didn't have a good time? You can be ghosted. I mean, there's rejection. Date two, you might not even feel the same spark. It's hard out there for a pimp. It really is.
It is, but I mean, this is also like one of those things that you can't get around. So one thing we know about human beings is that they are really, I mean, we're really risk averse. Like as much as we try to pretend that we're not, like we're risk averse, and uncertainty scares us. Like we get really, for most people, we don't like uncertainty. But with emotions, like there's no way to like ensure that the emotional response you want from somebody is going to actually manifest. Like there's no guarantee, it's a risk. But I think what human beings are trying to do, and this is a point I want to make about therapy, is that I think people are now trying to turn emotions into something that they can manage in a way that is very systematic and very scientific. But I think ultimately it's a dead end, because emotions aren't about being organized in a systematic and easily discernible way. Like part of the reason they're emotions is because a lot of times you can't explain why you feel a certain way. Like how many times have you met somebody, or maybe let's say you've been on a date with them, had a great time, but they've been flaky, but you still feel you still feel like you're drawn to them still. And you kind of hate that you still feel that way. And you're like, oh, why do I still like this person? Even though they don't respond to my text messages, they don't do these things. But that just goes to show how emotions are not rational. But trying to impose rationality in your emotions, in my view, is kind of a dead end. And so what I think people end up doing is that they end up like turning everything into some form of like psychoanalytics. So like, what am I doing or what am I not doing? When really like a lot of the shit that goes wrong, or let's say a lot of the reason that dating doesn't turn into what you want it to, isn't because of anything you are or aren't doing necessarily. Maybe it is, but not always. But we think that there are things that we can learn and control, and then that can change our fate. But what we really don't understand is that that's really pretty much the same thing that we do when we talk about like bootstrap, lifting yourself from your bootstraps. It's like, yeah, we tell a poor person, like there are all these structural conditions that we know exist, but we believe that people, if they just, you know, believe hard enough and work hard enough, they can achieve it. I'm just like, but we also have to think about like what around us is pushing against us. And I think that sometimes what we miss that.
Shouldn't we be in control and be able to manage our emotions though?
Why?
So we can be fully functioning human beings?
I think it depends on the context. So like, I think there are certain contexts in which, let's say, controlling one's emotional response to something is desired. So if you are in a public space and somebody sends you something and you scream in the middle of a public space, in this era, people are going to probably react in a way that is probably not the best. So you should probably be like, oh, like aware of your surroundings and like how your response to something might impact other people. But I don't necessarily buy the notion that we should always be monitoring our emotions. Sometimes being emotional is a part of the human condition. And so I think there are some times like we have to lean into that. And the thing is, like, the part of the reason we don't want to lean into it is because we know the other side of it. So she has another book called Why Love Hurts. And she makes the case that part of the reason that human beings are so avoidant of dating in let's say our contemporary culture is because we know the other side of it. We know what it feels like when something isn't reciprocated, or when somebody that we thought things might have been going well with, they reach out to us and be like, oh, hey, like JK, I actually had this other person that I was kind of like feeling more than you. Like we've all been there. And so like we try to avoid all of that. But I want to make the case that it's unavoidable. And there's no amount of therapy, there's no amount of like way of like trying to manage that can get you around that potential
Can you reiterate what's unavoidable?
The feeling of hurt. Yeah, or not necessarily hurt, but feelings of let's say an emotional response to something that isn't pleasurable. So maybe heartbreak or disappointment or frustration or something where like you can't avoid that. And I don't think trying to impose a cost benefit analysis on this is going to get you around that. Like sometimes you just emotions are they're unavoidable, and like part of being human is like recognizing that.
What is your issue with therapy?
What's my therapy? So before people try to drag me in the comments, I'm not anti going to therapy. This is my issue with therapy. I think that part of the issue that people have in our culture right now, like if I talk about people who people I know who go to therapy, like they often feel lonely. They might suffer from some sense of alienation, whether that's like alienated from their friends and family or whatever. They might feel like some sense of like lack of meaning in their lives. Maybe they hate their jobs, or like they're just doing something so routine. Like all of those things to me are often the way that people go about addressing those require people to turn inward and look at what they could do differently or what they are doing, without reckoning with the fact that we live in a society that often produces these feelings. So think about like chart out your most people's day-to-day lives. Like most people wake up, let's say 7 a.m., work from 8 to let's say 6 p.m., 5:30. If you live in a major city, you're probably spending a good amount of your time commuting. You get home, if like you're supposed to go to the gym, right? Like you're supposed to go to the gym. You're supposed to like make stuff to eat, because we're like told that eating all of the time is not good for us, even though like we have a whole culture that is like set up to like make us want takeout. But we're like psychologically told that we shouldn't be doing all these. I'll say, okay, so then you go to the gym, you cook. Next thing you know, it's 9 o'clock. And then you just rinse and repeat and do that pretty much ad nauseum. Okay, when are you going to find the time to like actually cultivate meaningful relationships with people, particularly new people? It's just,
The weekend.
yeah, but on the weekend, what do people end up doing? And so there was a really interesting article that came out in the Atlantic recently called How We Learn to Be Lonely. And so like what the author, and I can send you the link and you can link it for everybody, but like what the author talks about is that even though people talk about like how lonely they are on the weekends, they often end up falling back on streaming that new show that just came out, or like spending the weekend on the couch watching like old episodes of some show they used to love. And so even though the weekends are supposed to be set aside for being social, essentially,
Hmm.
people are not being social. And so the question is like, why? And I think part of that is going back to what I said earlier, is that people are just so burnt out from the way that capitalism just like grinds people to dust. And so I think that burnout is spilling over into our social lives, including our relationships, or our dating lives, I should say, because that takes time and energy and emotional investment that people just generally either don't have or not willing to give the little bit they might have. And so I think that's a big reason for that. And so to bring back to my critique of therapy,
I do like how you like connected it all together at the end.
yeah, it's just like, and so I'm not anti-therapy, but I think the way that therapy is, I mean, so think about therapy, like psychology is inherently individualistic. So it's oftentimes trying to identify unique or specific things to the individual. So like, why is this individual feeling this way they do? And oftentimes you'll go to your childhood or something that happened to you way back yonder that you never quite reckoned with, all the other shit. But what I'm always saying is that so many people feel the same, like irrespective of like whether or not you go to therapy, like you don't have to, sure, like everybody has their own set of particularities, things that are unique to them. Yes. But we also are social creatures who experience very similar things because we're all situated in a similar political economy. So we're all talking about how much we're burnt out, how much we hate dating, how much we find that like making relationships or like meeting new people is hard. So like my question is always, if so many people feel this way, irrespective of your gender, your race, like where, if you live in a city or a small town, like if all these people feel the same way, there has to be something more systematic or at least structural going on that we maybe need to think about. And so that's where I'm usually more inclined to look. That's not to disregard people's experiences, but like I think by focusing so much on people's individual experiences, we miss the ways that we're actually similar in a lot of ways. And I think if we could recognize some of those similarities, I think we could start to be like, oh, like, wow, I didn't realize other people felt similarly. And so, but what we do is we turn it into a pathology. And when we pathologize things, like we turn it into something that is out of the ordinary. So there's something wrong with that person, as opposed to, no, this person is just responding to into a political economy that is twisted. I mean, it really is.
Right.
Like you stop and think about how much time we spend working or doing things that we wouldn't otherwise want to do. And I would venture to say most of us would not be spending most of our time working if we had a choice in the matter.
One of our mutual friends, I mean, we had this conversation yesterday. That's what I meant to tell you. I mean, I'll tell you off camera, but yeah, they're talking about how they just feel like their day to day is mundane and, working, they're not fulfilled. And it's hard trying to tell somebody like, who's trying to find their fulfillment. I always think personally that I try to tell people that you have more control over your life than you think, and you just have to change something. But it could be the environment, like you're saying. I mean, we're all in the same matrix.
Yeah, well, it's not either or. So I don't want to say that people don't have agency or don't have some sense of control over what they want to do or what they can or can't do. Like I don't want to make that claim, and I'm not making that claim. What I'm saying is I do think we should take seriously the real constraints that make the constraints that make people feel less fulfilled or have some sense of purpose. And I think a lot of that is rooted in, again, political economy, specifically the way that work is structured, especially people in the middle class. I think middle class people more than anybody, more than any other class of people, are especially feeling this sense of lack of purpose or emptiness. Part of it is we're experiencing the same thing. So like where we see the most people who are suffering from dating are not necessarily having the type of dating interactions they want. It's often people middle class, upper middle class people. It's usually the people at the ends of the polls are usually doing much better with love and relationships than our people in the middle. And I think a lot of that is because we also, most of us work in environments where not only are we celebrated for working hard, but we're also like socialized to believe that there's something inherently like virtuous about working hard, which really is just saying there's something virtuous about going and selling out labor for somebody else to be rich, which is really what it is. But you can't say that. And so like, because you can't articulate it, people don't understand things, they can't articulate or name things because we live in a culture that really privileges language as a way of communicating. And some things are just beyond articulate, like we can't necessarily articulate things. I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about like what makes emotions so messy is that we can't always exactly articulate like our emotions, but how do you evaluate something if you can't articulate it? Or if you can't name exactly what you're experiencing. And there's just some things you can't. So I think those kind of contribute to a lot of that feeling that people have.
So we're talking about the single people, but what about the people that are already in relationships?
What specifically about people in relationships? Like,
so we're just specifically talking about just the single people that are dating. So like what happens once, you actually find somebody and you're in a relationship now?
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, so that's a great question. So in this book, she talks about the concept of what she terms unloving. So why is it that people fall in love or let's say enter some type of contract and then ultimately sever it? And so one of the reasons she makes the case that that happens is because people generally treat love and relationships as a commodity. So what do we do with a commodity once we feel like it's no longer serving us the value that it once did? Let's say you're a big video gamer, like you enjoyed your Super Nintendo until when?
Until the next system came out.
Right, because the next system had more bells and whistles. It was newer, it was more valuable. Like it could provide you with something that the Super Nintendo couldn't anymore. Or maybe you had just grown tired of the Super Nintendo. You had all the games you wanted from it. You pretty much extracted everything out of that you wanted to get out of it, and it wasn't providing you anything anymore. She makes the case that part of the reason that happens, this unloving process happens, is because human beings treat relationships as commodities. Whenever they feel like they aren't extracting enough value from another person, or let's say how the other person is treating them is satisfying some internal, let's say, desire they might have, like they're more inclined to move on to something else, maybe to another person or what have you. And the reason that she makes the case that the reason that we see relationships, let's say, or these instances of unloving happen more frequently is because we now live in an era in which the process of unloving is viewed as like one way of expressing your freedom. So if you're no longer happy, you can just go on to the next, which she's not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but just saying that it's much different than in previous, like this is why I get so annoyed with, not annoyed, but I always chuckle with, you've heard people be like, well, my grandparents were married for like 60 years, 70 years. Like, why could they do it? And I'm just like, yeah, you realize like women were still considered property until like 1970. Like, there was a reason that your grandma didn't just like hop out, because she probably wasn't gonna be able to get a job. Like in many places, like women didn't drive. Like there was a very strong, like gendered way of structuring our world. I mean, our world is still very gendered. There's still very clear differences between the way that men and women are recognized, both socially, legally, and so forth. But now part of unloving is it's a way for people to express their own freedom. So at the moment that you don't feel like you are, let's say, fulfilled, you just go on. And Now, is that a bad? I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. Like, I'm not saying that you should just like remain in a commitment to somebody if you don't feel as though, like, let's say it's being reciprocated. But I do think it changes the terms of things. And because also going back to my early point that human beings are risk averse, we in the back of our heads know that most marriages end in divorce, most relationships in breakups. Like, we know that. Now we try to square that circle because we also live in a culture where people are, where optimism is kind of beat into us. Like, you can't say that. Like, you have to go into it with the idea that this is going to last forever, but we know what the political and the social reality is. And so there's this kind of internal contradiction that I don't think we ever fully worked through. And so she makes the case that that's always kind of lurking in the back of our head. And so we're in some ways always looking for that thing that is going to lead us to what is the obvious outcome, or is the inevitable outcome. And so like, you might come home from work and talk about how much you had a bad day. And then, I don't know, maybe your partner didn't seem like they were really listening, or they were only half listening. She makes the case that people would, in this type of situation that we have now, would be inclined to assign probably more meaning to that than would have been the case, let's say, 60 years ago.
I still think there's people that like, they just want to try their hardest to stick to like the old school, old fashioned values, like from courting to like going on all these dates to I need to be married by the time I'm 30 or something like that. I want to have kids by the time I'm 35. Look, my mom had me at 32. I wouldn't know what to do with a child at 32 right now.
So that's a good point. So she talks about how even though you can't understand relationships outside of like thinking about politics and the economy, and the reason you have to understand politics is because, think about it, women, part of the reason you had the patriarchal structure of society is because it was legally codified that way. So you had the legal question, and then obviously, since women often were either kept out, in many respects, kept out of the workplace or reduced to doing some of the most menial tasks, like there was obviously an economic component too. So you can't understand any of this without understanding the transformations in the way that our economy and our political world are structured. So if we think about the economy now, like what are the things that we value the most? Like, we want a job that allows us flexibility. We want a job where we're not necessarily going to be, told handheld or what we call micromanaged. And so again, this idea of flexibility and freedom. If you hate your job, what do people do often, especially in the middle class? They start looking for another one. People don't stay in jobs for 40 and 50 years anymore like they used to. So all of those norms that were associated with, let's say, stability and kind of pushing back against change and just being committed to what was familiar, all of that is out the window now. Like, we don't really live in a culture that values like static things anymore. We want change, and we don't feel, unless there's change, we don't feel like we're growing. And that's also something that's very kind of unique to American culture, is that we're so committed to this idea of growth, or this idea of progress. And so, but all of this kind of cuts against what's required to cultivate meaningful relationships with people, which is time, patience, effort, some degree of stability, and all of those other things. And so I think why a lot of people ultimately, why many marriages end in divorce, or why many relationships in unloving, is because we're trying to, like you said, apply these old standards to a new political economy that is nothing like how it was when our grandparents were married. The way that relationships actually exist are changing, but the norms haven't caught up to the actual structural changes. So we're trying to apply old school norms to the way that things are in 2023. So I don't know, like, people just need to update. Another book that I think is important, and I'll leave it, it's called Consuming the Romantic Utopia. So part of the reason she makes the case that these norms are so late to catch up is because everything we're fed culturally is feeding us a fairy tale. So every movie we see, every TV show, it's just, everything is so Disney-fied. And so we never have any like objective or like views of Or if we do have relationships that end, it's always so tragic. Like somebody like cheats on somebody in like this super salacious way. It's never just like the mundane aspects of dating.
I can see how someone can call you a radical sometimes.
I embrace
Kidding
that.
though,
I
but
embrace that.
also I just want to add, I do think that our current environment now, social, political, or whatever, I do think it's contributing to the rise in new norms in dating and relationships, because it feels like, these days, a lot of, I'm guessing our demo is in open relationships, and there's new types of relationships to go into.
Right. So I wouldn't say it's a norm yet, because you can see that anytime questions about like, let's say non-monogamous relationships comes, it always gets people ready to fight, or like people get in a tizzy about it. So if there's that much argumentation going on, I think that's another example of it hasn't reached the status of becoming a norm yet. Because once something becomes a norm, it becomes kind of habitual. Like you don't even think about it. You just kind of take it for granted. So I do think that old norms are being challenged, but I don't think enough people, or I would say most people, have not gotten to the point to where they're really willing to critically assess like why they take certain things for granted. And I think that's just going to take time. But I think part of the reason they have a hard time doing that is because they are fed this like Sesame Street imagery about the way that relationships should be.
So we're going to wrap it up, y'all. And I want to know, what is the main takeaway you want our audience to get?
What I want people to understand is that your emotions are not just things. Like they're not just entities that you can pick apart and like move around and like try to piece together in a perfect way. No, that's not human. You can't do that. And as much as you want to believe that you can, you can't. And I think that's important, because I think once we understand that, you can see why. But that's kind of the catch-22 of dating. Like on one hand, we can all remember how we've all been in a date where, again, the butterflies are just fluttering like crazy. If you try to stop yourself from experiencing that, think about how empty you would feel ultimately. And so I want people to like reckon with that. I want people to embrace that. That's not to say that you should always allow your emotions to dictate your behavior. I mean, you can go down a list of circumstances where acting solely based on your emotional, let's say your emotional inclinations would not be a good thing. But I think sometimes we take it too far in thinking that we can just rationalize everything, which we can't. And so I just want people to really think about what are they doing in their day-to-day lives, really thinking about like what about their day-to-day lives might make experiencing that harder on them, whether that's being burnt out or what have you, and then really just be intentional about like trying to get to the source of that. And that's not to say that you can't use therapy to do that, but I do think the old-fashioned way of like talking to people about it in an open way can also provide some insights that I don't think that therapy could.
Well said. This would have made a really good Valentine's Day episode.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that holiday is coming up. I went to Target and all I saw was red and pink.
Oh yeah, I mean they jumped straight. I mean December 26th, it was straight Valentine's. Yeah.
Which again, capitalism, they make sure, Anywho, let the people know what books you had, like the 3 books. One of them is titled End of Love, right?
The End of Love. So yeah, one is, I would recommend The End of Love.
Such an optimistic title.
The End of Love. There's another one called Cold Intimacies. It's called Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism. So it talks about like how emotions within capitalism are contradictory and how we try to manage them and why that's not necessarily the best thing to do. And then this other is called Consuming the Romantic Utopia, which is pretty much why watching all these TV shows and movies that guarantee a happy Disney ending are really doing us a disservice, because it's not letting us see how things are actually operating in real life. So yeah, read one of those, or all of them.
I actually might check out the 3rd book. I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a little old because it came out in like the late 90s. So she doesn't really delve too as deep into like the internet and stuff, but it's still a good read.
Well, y'all, I would love to hear y'all feedback in the comments. Please, if you have any questions for Jared, feel free. Like, I'm sure he reads the comments. Also, do not flag his opinions. These are all opinions, okay?
Feel free to disagree. I not only welcome it, but I embrace it.
Yes, he does welcome a healthy discourse. Also, where can they follow you or where can they find you on social media?
Yes, I am reluctantly still on Twitter. J A
I know,
Y
right?
right JAYC Tiger fan. Also Instagram too.
Well, y'all, that was our episode. I'm sure we'll be back with, another radical episode of Poli-Side-Eye. Make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.